friend of mine, his name's Tim Downs, years ago wrote a book called Finding Common Ground. Now, it's a book on how to present the truth of the gospel, and more specifically, how do you present God's timeless truth, but you present it in a timely way? How do we speak truth to people and do it in love? Well, Tim humorously writes about his first evangelistic experience. I'd like to share that with you. Tim would say it was an experience that is the exact opposite of speaking truth in love. In the fall of 1975, I was actively involved in a Christian ministry at Indiana University. At one of the weekly meetings, the campus director unexpectedly announced that there would be no presentation that evening. Instead, we were all going to pair up, go out on the campus to find someone with whom to share our faith. He writes, the announcement was met with the same enthusiasm as if it announced that we were all having root canals. But this was just the kind of thing that a campus ministry did in the mid-70s. So we all reluctantly agreed to go to meet back in an hour to tell of our experiences. He writes, my roommate and I decided to team up. We headed out in the streets of downtown Bloomington, Indiana, to look for an appropriate target. We spotted a solitary figure standing under a streetlight. He met all the criteria. He was alone. He seemed to have nothing to do, and he was smaller than we were. We approached. I said, hi, my name is Tim, and this is Dave. I forgot to ask his name, of course. We'd like to share with you the contents of this little yellow booklet. Would that be okay with you? This young man turned and began to walk slowly away, his eyes glued to the sidewalk. He said nothing in response to our question, so we assumed his consent. And so I began to read. This first page says, just as there are laws to govern the physical universe, so there are spiritual laws that govern our relationship with God. I plunged ahead. As I finished each of the 4 spiritual laws, I was careful to stop and add an illustration or explanation. And for his part, he said nothing. He simply began to pick up the pace of his walk, his eyes never leaving the ground before him. I continued, man is sinful and separated from God, so we cannot know him personally and experience his love. We came to an intersection. Without waiting for the light to change, he darted across. We were right behind him, reading fast. I continued, Jesus Christ is God's only provision for man's sin. Through him alone, we can know God personally and experience his love. By this time, we were almost in a dead run. What a sight we must have been. One student running down the sidewalk with 2 others in hot pursuit, reading as they went, like some sort of mobile study group. We arrived at his dormitory just as I had finished my presentation. He was out of sidewalk, I was out of 4 laws, and we were all out of breath. He flung open the door, wheeled around, and looked at us for the first time. His glare was a presentation in itself. He said, thank you, sarcastically. You have just repeated to me everything I had to listen to for 8 years of private school. We began the long, long walk back to the meeting place, dreading the upcoming opportunity to tell other students the story of our profound spiritual encounter. I could hear the other students' stories now, the lonely freshman from a broken home who received the gospel in tears. And then, of course, there's the alcoholic pre-med student who not only came to faith, but became sober instantly. Then there was the impromptu testimony given at a drunken fraternity party, which ended with all the brothers joining hands singing, How Great Thou Art. Then it would be our turn. Well, we would say we read a tract to one guy. He tried to run away, but we stayed right with him. We're not sure, but we think he'll be enrolling in seminary in the fall. Tim would go on to say, we did not speak the truth in love to this individual. He would go on to say, we targeted him, and it was a disaster. Now you think about it. Okay, if we're supposed to share our faith, because one of the values of our church is evangelism, so how do we do it? Truth is the gospel, which, let me define the gospel. Jesus died. He was buried. He rose from the grave. The gospel must be communicated. In Romans chapter 10, verses 14, and then in verse 17, it says this: how shall they call upon him whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without somebody to tell them? And then in verse 17, it says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So for someone to place their faith in Jesus, they must understand who Jesus is and what he has done for them. See, the understanding of who Jesus is must be explained by someone. You might not know the exact date or time that you became a Christ follower, but that does not mean that someone or several someones did not explain the gospel to you. And it certainly doesn't mean that you didn't hear or accept the gospel message. No one can argue that the gospel does not need to be communicated to be understood. The question is, what is the best way of telling others in all the various situations that life affords us? Let me make a pit stop. I think this raises an interesting issue. If the gospel that Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose from the grave, if the gospel needs to be communicated, which the scriptures clearly argue for, what about the person that has never heard? That person that is in some remote corner of the globe where the name of Jesus has never been proclaimed? Well, fortunately, God is not taken off guard by that question. In the book of Romans chapter 1 verse 20, it states that people are without excuse because God's qualities are clearly seen in his creation. What do you mean by that? Well, God's intricate design, God's order, all the beauty he's created points to the existence of a divine creator. Plus, we have to admit, God's fingerprints are on us. Because we, above all other created beings, are created in the image of God. We have a knowledge of right and wrong, and God's moral laws are somehow imprinted on our hearts. So because of creation and God's fingerprints on our life, no one is left in the dark. For anyone, the truth that God reveals to us can be accepted or rejected. And the more an individual accepts the revelation that God gives them, to them God will reveal more revelation until eventually God reveals to them that Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose from the grave. See, the scriptures are quite clear. The believer in Jesus Christ has a responsibility to tell others about Jesus, but the scriptures are also clear that God is responsible to reveal truth through his creation, through other obedient followers, and obviously through his written love letter to us, the Bible. God is extremely proficient at getting truth where it needs to go. See, the focus of what we will look at this morning is how God uses the Apostle Paul to penetrate spheres of influence with the gospel. And as a result, how can we be used by God to continue to penetrate spheres of influence with the gospel? We've been doing a series through the book of Acts. Let me give you some context where we are. The context, Paul has been in jail for 2 years in a place called Caesarea. It's right on the coast of Israel. He's being held by the Romans. Paul's imprisonment has exceeded the 2-year expiration date. What do I mean by that? Well, because Paul was being held for over 2 years, he should have been released. There's been no decision reached on whether Paul is innocent or guilty. Festus, who is the current governor of the region, is confused. He finds no validity in any accusation made by Jewish leaders against Paul. As far as Festus is concerned, the accusations are little more than name-calling and false narratives that have been created by men. So Festus needs some help to better understand what is going on. So Festus solicits the help of the puppet Jewish king in the area. His name is Herod Agrippa, and also Agrippa's sister, Bernice. We pick up the story in chapter 25, verse 13 through 14. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. It says this: "Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and his sister Bernice arrived at Caesarea, paid their respects to the Roman governor, Festus." Verse 14, "While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, 'There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix.'" So it's kind of like we know that he's been there for over 2 years. First of all, we need to answer the question, who is this Herod Agrippa? Well, let me give you some history. Herod Agrippa's great-grandfather was Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus when Jesus was born. Herod Agrippa's grandfather, well, he was the guy that killed John the Baptist and also could find no guilt in Jesus, but he mocked Jesus. Herod Agrippa's father had James, the brother of John, martyred. And now you have Agrippa II and his sister Bernice, who, by the way, some extra revelation that I don't know if you need or not, but Agrippa and his sister were known to have an incestual relationship. Ick. So this is the family tree of Agrippa. Not very impressive. Now Festus, remember, is confused. How can the religious leaders in Jerusalem look at Paul as such a threat when Festus can find no crime that Paul has committed? And he's thinking maybe someone with an overview of this Jewish culture, this Jewish mentality, can help Festus make sense of the situation. That's why Festus brings Agrippa into the situation. Now, I'm not going to read verses 15 through 18. Let me tell you, though, in verses 15 and 16, Festus describes to Agrippa what has transpired so far. He said this religious leaders in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, have brought charges against Paul. And even though the charges have no witnesses to verify their authenticity, they still want me to kill Paul. So he's telling this to Agrippa. I've told them Paul's a Roman and I can't try him in any other way except by Roman law. Then in verse 17 and 18, Festus continues to inform Agrippa what happened. I brought Paul before me. I allowed the Jewish leaders to bring their accusations forward, but there were no witnesses. Just name-calling, stories that they had made up that they can't prove. And this is where Festus is really confused. This is why Festus is asking Agrippa, would you shed some light on this? Now in verse 19. But they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. A dead man named Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Festus, the Roman governor, first of all, he's pointing out there's non-verifiable accusations, the name calling. And then he says to Agrippa, he says, they keep bringing up a story about a man named Jesus whom Paul is saying is still alive. So Festus is asking Agrippa, who is this Jesus, and what is this business about him still being alive? Agrippa, would you help me, Festus, make sense of this? Now this raises a question. How does Festus not know about who Jesus is? Just 30 years before the greatest miracle ever demonstrated. And they don't know about Jesus. Jesus isn't new news. Jesus' confirmable resurrection. Jesus' 11 appearances to over 500 over a 40-day period of time. Jesus' followers are multiplying in every city in the known world. The testimonies of people's lives being changed from the inside out. Criminals turned to servants. Evil men that are turned into good deed doers. Christ followers that leave in their wake acts of service, the likes of which the world has never seen. So how do you, Festus, a Roman ruler, not know who Jesus is? Jesus' influence is unmatched by any character in history. Not even close. They don't know. He doesn't know who Jesus is. for the same reason that people today don't have a clue who the real Jesus is. 2,000 years after Jesus walked the planet and people devoted to Jesus are still willing to die for him, how do you not know, if you're alive in this century, how do you not know who this Jesus is? And all his accomplishments, and his teachings, and his miracles. How is it possible that if you surveyed your non-Christian neighbors and your non-Christian coworkers, they, in 2025, would react similarly to Festus and say, who's this Jesus? And what's this business about him no longer being dead? What is this? And that is possible because of what Paul writes to the church at Corinth. In his second letter, he writes in chapter 4, verses 3 through 4. He says, the gospel is veiled. It's covered. It is veiled to those who are perishing. Well, why is it veiled? Because of verse 4. The God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Jesus, who is the image of God. Why do people not know? It's because the God of this world has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. That's why you'll never hear in a secular world what you should hear in church. That Jesus is alive. That he died, he was buried, he rose. And that's why Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14, the natural man, the person who doesn't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them. That's why when a non-believer overhears us talk about Easter Sunday and that the tomb is empty, in their natural mind, they just lump that in the same category with the groundhog, that he saw a shadow, and that means there's 6 more weeks of winter. That's why your neighbors look at you with an awkward smile. When you choose, you actually chose to get up out of bed this morning and come here. In their mind, that's in the category of foolish. People are in the dark about Jesus. They don't get it. And please understand, we think in our culture, oh, if I see something and I see the authenticity, then I will believe. That's not true about Christianity. You need to understand something. Seeing is not believing. Believing is seeing. Because once you believe in Jesus Christ, the God of this world who has blinded you, now Jesus opens the eyes of the blind, and now you see for the first time. Think with me a second. I'm building case. You turn on the news, there's nothing about Jesus. There's nothing about Christianity. There's nothing about an empty tomb. There's nothing about the greatest individual in human history. Why? Because the God of this world has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. Think with me for a second. If today we went home and on this Mother's Day hypothetical situation, you turned on the news, and on the news there was this somebody had created the cure for cancer. All cancers, boom, gone. All you got to do is take this secret sauce, tastes a little like barbecue sauce, you put it between the cheek and gum, gone. No cancer, cured. You know what? Everybody on the planet would hear about that, right? Everybody on the planet would rush to get some of this secret sauce. You couldn't hide it. But you think about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ rose from the grave, it not only conquered, it conquered something far greater than your physical ailments. When Jesus Christ conquered death and rose from the grave, what happened is your eternal destiny became possible in heaven. That is far greater than a temporal death of cancer. I'm not minimizing cancer. It's horrible. But you know what's greater than that is an eternal separation from God. And yet, if we had somebody cure cancer, you couldn't keep the news down. Why is it that the greatest thing that's ever been discovered is the cure for sin and death, and you can't find a news story in the secular world about it? Why is that? Because the God of this world has blinded the eyes of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ. So now, Here's the scenario. Festus describes this scenario to Agrippa about this Jesus who's still alive. Agrippa has no more insight than Festus does. How do you guys not know? So Agrippa asks for an appointment with Paul. Now I want you to observe this whole story. I want you to consider something: who's in control. Who is in control of history, what's taking place, is not Festus, the Roman governor. It's not Agrippa, the puppet Jewish king. The one in charge is the King eternal that Paul, a prisoner, represents. And God keeps arranging divine appointments for Paul to proclaim the gospel. And every time Paul is imprisoned, every time Paul is persecuted in his story, Paul gets a speaking assignment. You cannot stop the message of Christ. Why? Because greater is Jesus who is in us than the evil one in the world. And just because the evil one blinds the eyes of the unbelievers, greater is Jesus who opens the eyes of the blind. And every time somebody comes to know Jesus Christ, people go, I don't see any miracles today. You're not looking clearly. Every time somebody places their faith in Jesus Christ, they go from darkness to light. It's the greatest miracle. It causes the Dead Sea thing, pales in comparison. When you placed your faith in Jesus Christ, He rescued you out of hell, placed you in heaven. It's the greatest miracle. He transported you to a kingdom that is everlasting with the Heavenly Father. It's the greatest miracle in Scriptures. Every time someone comes to know Christ, it's a miracle. When Jesus opens the eyes of the blind. Beforehand, all this stuff about Jesus is like, who's Jesus? It's like, I remember meeting somebody, who's Jesus? It's like a bar of soap or something. It's like, what do you do? And then all of a sudden when they come to know the Lord, it's like, boom. It's like, they're in a new world. And the God of this world blinds us, but Jesus opens our eyes. So the meeting is set up with Agrippa. In verse 23, it says, so on the next day, when Agrippa came together with his dear sister Bernice amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city of Caesarea, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Here's the setting. If you were to go to Israel today, and you were to go to this city called Caesarea, it's not a functional city, it's just a bunch of ruins. You could go to this theater where there's stone bleachers there, and there is a stone throne. You can go, you can sit on the throne today. You can sit in the stone bleachers today, 2,000 years later. And here's the setting. Everybody in the area, prominent men of the city, are invited in so they can hear the Apostle Paul give a description about who Jesus is. Then in verses 24 through 27, Festus, before he turns the microphone over to Paul, Festus gives a speech before Paul speaks. Verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here in this outdoor theater, you see the man with whom the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that you ought to not live any longer. These accusers say Paul ought to be killed, verse 25, but I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. And since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him to the emperor. But, verse 26, I have nothing definite about him to write to Caesar. Therefore, I have brought him here before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. Basically, Festus is saying, I've got no reason to send him to be judged by Caesar. What am I sending him to be judged about? Verse 27, for it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. So Festus gives this speech. I know I'm supposed to send Paul to Caesar in Rome, but I'm not sure why I'm sending him to Caesar. I don't know what he's done. I don't know what to communicate to Caesar about the charges that have been brought against him. Now, next week, I'm going to give you what Paul says. But I want to conclude this morning by letting you in on the big idea of this story. We, as Jesus followers, have a responsibility. And God has a responsibility. We can't do what God does, nor are we called to. God has revealed himself in such a way that no one has an excuse. And God has revealed himself that we have to respond to the light that he's revealed. And we can choose to reject the light he's revealed, or we can accept the light he's revealed. God has set up a meeting for Paul before Agrippa and this group of people in Caesarea. And Paul is simply responding to tell people about Jesus. In the same way, God, whether you realize it or not, is setting up divine appointments for you to tell others about Jesus. All we are responsible for is to make a ready defense of who we believe Jesus is when the opportunity arises. That's all we're responsible for. See, the gospel must be communicated eventually by someone for someone to hear it. The gospel must be heard for it to be comprehended and responded to. Osmosis is not how we become believers in Jesus. We don't all of a sudden, hey, sleep on this. And there'll be some sort of fluid that passes through into your noggin. I believe. Ah. No, it's based upon principles. We believe there is a transfer, but it's a transfer of knowable, confirmable information. And the Spirit of God enables us to embrace the information which is true. Now, let me tell you something. Every place I have ever lived, every place I have ever gone, one thing I know is certain. If you look for the opportunity to represent Jesus, if you are ready to talk about who Jesus is and what he has done, God will give you someone to tell about the greatest person and the greatest event in human history. If you are ready and if you are willing, God will give you an opportunity to talk about the greatest person and the greatest event in human history. He will. Here's the problem, though. Believers are not looking for the opportunity. Because we're afraid we're going to be seen as my friend Tim running after people, reading them some religious book, rather than being on the alert to exchange ideas with people in our everyday place of work, in our everyday neighborhood. We're afraid that people don't know, they don't want to know about Jesus. And yet, you did. You're here. Why wouldn't somebody else want to eventually know? And now let me let you in on something. I'm just about done. I want to let you in on something, and I want you to hear it. When we are open to the opportunity, when you are open to the opportunity to tell somebody about Jesus, God will use you to send messages to places you will never go. Julie and I, this past weekend, we were in, last weekend, we flew into Atlanta, Georgia. We were speaking at a marriage conference in Atlanta. It was a very nice hotel. It was a Friday morning. The event doesn't start until Friday afternoon, Friday evening. We're there in the foyer getting ready to eat a breakfast brunch. A man and a woman come up to us, say, Dan, Julie. They came up and gave us a hug. I was thinking, I have no idea who you are. Strangers don't normally identify me and give me hugs. They introduced themselves as Leon and LaShawn Brooks. They said, there's no reason you should know us. In 2001, you were in Houston. 2001, that's 24 years ago. You were in Houston. We were an engaged couple. You told us about Jesus. You told us about how he can just, you don't want to leave home without him. You want to enter your marriage with him. You marked our life. 24 years ago, this dear couple, and they said, we looked you guys up. We came to this family life conference because we wanted to come back. 24 years later, 5 kids later, I didn't tell them to do that. He's an associate pastor in Houston. They're coming to this conference. They've been married for 24 years. He's in ministry. And I thought, I don't share that. Please understand something. I don't share something because it's like, wow, Julie and I, we were remarkable. I don't even remember meeting them. All we did was go, hey, there's Jesus. Follow him. He will transform your life. He will shake the foundations of your life. He will transform you from the inside out. And you will make an impact on the world that you never thought possible. That's all we did. God did the transformative work. God took them. God orchestrated them. God gave them 5 children. And I hope they're stopping with that. And I thought, you know what? Just by going, hey, follow Jesus. All we did was took those, those orange flashlights and we just follow him. Follow him. And they did. Who does that? And as Julie and I have gotten older, God gives us these periodical windows where we go, it did matter. It did matter what we said. And sometimes you think, I'm going to step out and I'm going to go, well, you know what? The reason God's taken my life is, the reason I'm in the way, because I've fallen in love with Jesus, and I believe that he's alive, and he's in my heart, and he's transforming me, and, oh, well, that was stupid. And then you come find out 24 years later, it mattered. Please hear me, if you are willing to talk about the greatest person in human history, if you are willing to talk about the greatest event in human history, only if you are willing, God will give you divine appointments where all of a sudden you'll be face to face with somebody and you have no idea why. And you will send messages that will ring in eternity. You will send messages to places that you will never physically go. The problem is that most American Christians, we shun the idea because we're so afraid of what people might think of us. I think we need to be a little bit more concerned about what God says about us and what God tells us to do than being fearful of what man thinks of us. I want us to pick up an offering. And I always, for those of you visiting, whenever you come, I give a contemplative question as we're passing out the offering. This is what I want to ask you to do right now. Again, I don't want to take away your free will. God doesn't take away your free will. But I want you to do business with God. And I want to challenge you right now to ask God in the privacy of your life, right now, as we pass out these plates, just to say, just go before the Lord and say, God, will you give me the desire? This is all I'm asking you. God, will you give me the desire to send messages to places I will never go? Will you just give me that desire? Let's go ahead and pass out the offering. Lord, will you use us to send messages to places that we will never go? Will we take on that mantle of the miraculous?